Hello oceanography students. For this video we are going to be talking about some different marine communities or I guess this week we'll be talking about different marine communities. For this video in particular we're just going to do a general introduction and then talk about the intertidal communities and also subtidal communities. So in the next video you'll learn more about the pelagic environment and deep benthic. Okay. So just to remind you of the different zones, the Neritic province is the province that is over the continental shelf. We could also call that kind of coastal. And then beyond that, you can say it's the oceanic province, but generally, if it's away from land, we refer to it as pelagic. So overland, we have the intertidal zone, which consists of the area between the high tide line out to the low tide line. So this area is going to be either submerged part of the day or out of the water part of the day. Then past the low tide line, you have what's called the subtidal zone. And the subtidal zone can be split up between the inner subtidal zone and the outer subtidal zone, inner being more shallow, outer being obviously deeper. And then we can go into the pelagic environment, which is basically all the open water, and also deep benthic as well. All right, and this is just an idea of what kind of organisms you might find in each of those zones. So intertidal and subtidal, you're going to find some seaweeds and seagrasses and corals, like we talked about in the previous video. And then as you go out into open water, you're going to find larger nekton, like whales and sharks and tuna and squid. And then as you go deeper down, you'll find organisms that live in the deep, dark ocean. And those could be a lot of organisms that are kind of smaller, generally speaking, because they don't get a lot of nutrients. And often soft-bodied other than the fish that are down there, but the fish can even be fairly soft-bodied as well. Okay, so the Neritic zone is the area that lies over the continental shelf. This consists of the intertidal zone, which is mostly benthic, and the subtidal zone, which is benthic or pelagic. The reason why the intertidal is mostly benthic is because the water is very shallow, and so most of the things are crawling around on the bottom. When it's high tide, you can still have small fish swimming in as well. And then in the subtidal zone, this is going to be benthic if it's on the bottom, or pelagic if it's in really deep water out along the edge of the continental shelf. And then we go into the open water zone, which is the area that lies beyond the continental shelf. And we can break that into two categories, pelagic being just open water, meaning that there is no bottom in sight, and benthic would be anything that's along the bottom, off of the continental shelf, and also the very deep water zone. Okay, so when we're talking about the benthic communities, the substrate type is really important. So substrate is the dominant bottom type, for example, sand or rocks or mud, like we often see in the bay. And what kind of substrate there is depends on wave activity. It also depends on current activity. It depends on the shape of the shoreline, right? As we learned, that wave activity can affect the shape of the shoreline, and therefore areas that are jutting out are going to be more rocky, and areas that are kind of in, like little coves, are going to have more sand or more smaller particle stuff. And then it also depends on what the terrestrial sediment sources are. For example, if you don't have any bigger rocks, then you're not going to have any big rocks on the beach, even if you do have heavier wave activity. All right, so the types of organisms that are found will depend on what kind of substrate there is. So if you have a very hard bottom environment, then you're going to find a lot of organisms that are termed sessile organisms, which means that they live attached to the substrate, and they might crawl around, but a sessile organism is usually something that stays in one place, like a barnacle or a mussel. And then if you have more soft bottom environments, similar to the picture on the left here, then you will probably have a lot of infauna, which means organisms that bury themselves in the sand or in the mud. Okay, so we're going to start with the neritic environment, the coastal environment. It's the shore out to about 200 meters depth, and it's split up into two zones again. The intertidal zone, which is also called the littoral zone, is the area between the high and the low tide. And this is pretty much all benthic, like I said before, because it's shallow water, so it's basically communities that live along the bottom. And then the subtidal zone, or also called the sublittoral zone, is beyond the low tide to a depth of about 200 meters. Basically, that's about where the continental shelf break is. So you can split that up into the inner and the outer. And the inner is the area where macroalgae will grow. So seaweeds and kelp can grow in the inner, as well as seagrasses as well, because it's shallow enough that the sunlight is penetrating all the way to the bottom. The outer subtidal zone is going to be too deep for sunlight to get all the way to the bottom. So instead of being dominated by algae or even coral, you're going to see mostly phytoplankton in that area. Okay, and the subtidal zone can be both benthic or pelagic because the water is deeper. Okay, so since we're talking about coastal waters, I wanted to bring up some points about the difference in salinity and temperature changes in coastal waters versus more open waters. So when you are in water along the coast, you would be very much affected by conditions that happen on land. So for example, the salinity can fluctuate more rapidly along the coast than off of the coast because you have runoff when it rains. So the rain comes down on land and then it runs off into the ocean. And that's going to decrease the salinity of the water close to the land. The opposite of that would be where you have a very dry wind. Now, because the water is more shallow in that area, evaporation is going to occur more readily because the water is also going to warm up more easily. So that's another thing. Temperature. Shallow waters heat up more quickly and they cool down more quickly as well. So since these waters are in the coast are more shallow, they tend to see greater fluctuations in temperature and salinity as well. Okay, the most extreme fluctuations that we see occur in the intertidal zone and in the estuary. So in the intertidal zone, that's going to be really shallow water, and some areas in the intertidal zone have what are called tide pools, which are basically like indentations in the sand or in the rocks where water stays there even as the tide goes out. And so that's very shallow water. It's much more easy for that water to warm up or to cool down because it's right next to the air. And then in estuaries, they are basically surrounded by land, and therefore they're going to be very affected by the conditions that are occurring, such as rain and runoff or temperature fluctuations. Okay, so let's start out with the intertidal zone. This is the area where the land meets the sea. So in this image here, the intertidal zone is going to be just this area right here between the high tide and the low tide. Okay, so these little organisms that are living here, if it's high tide, they're underwater. If it's low tide, they're out of water. All right, so they're seeing the most extreme changes over the course of the day compared to any place else in the sea. All right, and again, it's also called the littoral zone. So communities that are found in the intertidal zone that we have terms for include wetlands, the rocky intertidal zone, sandy beaches, oyster reefs, mudflats, mangroves. These are all examples of intertidal zone. All right, so like we've talked about a little bit already, intertidal communities face extreme conditions that can be stressful to their health. And these conditions can be broken down into two categories. Abiotic effects are the physical or the chemical factors affecting organisms. So these are things that are affecting the organisms that are not brought on by other organisms, whereas biotic effects are factors affecting the organisms that are brought on by other organisms. So some important abiotic effects that exist in the intertidal zone include exposure to air. So as the tide goes out and it goes from a high tide down to a low tide, all of those organisms that are in the intertidal zone are going to be exposed to the air. Now, marine organisms, they don't have the thick skin that we have. Our thick skin allows us to not dry out. They don't have that, and therefore, if they're exposed to air, they can actually dry out and die. Additionally, exposure to air means greater fluctuations in temperature compared to water, right? Water doesn't change temperature as quickly as air does, as we learned about with the term specific heat capacity, right? Water has a higher specific heat capacity than land does. And so when the tide is out and there's no water over them, then they are exposed to the air, whatever that temperature is. It could be either hotter than the water or it could be colder than the water. They're also exposed to wave activity. So a lot of these organisms that live in the intertidal zone live attached to rocks. So if you have strong wave activity that can rip you off of the rocks, then you basically could die. And the water itself sees greater fluctuations in salinity, greater fluctuations in temperature, and also changes in oxygen. If the water is high tide, then all of those organisms are under the water, and therefore they can breathe because they breathe the dissolved oxygen that is in the water. When it's a low tide and they are out of water, they can't breathe, they don't have oxygen. Okay, so that's going to obviously be very stressful for them. Imagine if you had to hold your breath every day for like 3 hours. So a salinity fluctuation, like I previously mentioned, you have rain and runoff, which can lower the salinity, or you could have a greater amount of evaporation, which could raise the salinity. All right. For biotic factors, these are going to include predation, right? Organisms trying to eat you. Lack of food when the tide is out. A lot of marine organisms that are in the intertidal zone actually need to filter the water for their food, and therefore if there's no water over them, then they can't filter for food, so they can't eat during that time. And then for organisms that grow attached to rocks especially, they have to compete for space on the rocks. So if they don't have a home to live, then they can't grow and reproduce and be successful. Okay? So the intertidal zone is stressful, but intertidal organisms have adaptations to deal with this, and these adaptations contribute to where in the intertidal zone they can live. So what is an adaptation? It's something that allows an organism to be well suited for its environment, and it happens over a very long period of time. And it doesn't just happen to the organism itself, right, in an organism's lifetime. It happens to the population of organisms. Certain ones have traits that make them more successful at surviving and reproducing. Those traits get passed along and get amplified over time, and that's evolution. All right, so let's look at some adaptations for being exposed to air when the tide is out. How does one avoid drying out? Well, there's a couple of ways, a couple of strategies that have been employed. One, if you are mobile, you can move to moist areas such as crabs. So some crabs will actually like hide under rocks where there is a pool of water that sits there, or they can actually just go back to the low tide zone underwater. For organisms that stick to rocks and can't move, one tactic is having a shell that one can close off, and in closing that off, they are trapping moisture within their shell, so they're not going to be drying out. For example, the barnacle can close off its shell and keep its body moist, and also snails have what's called an operculum, which allows them to basically seal off their shell. And so you can see there this snail's operculum right here. And then mussels, which grow attached to the rocks, they tend to grow very close together, and in doing so, they trap moisture in between them. And so even if their shell, they have a shell which they can close off also, but even if their shell is slightly open, they're still in a fairly moist environment. Or you can just be able to deal with it, such as the fucus, which is rockweed, a type of algae, type of brown algae. It can actually dry out up to 90% of its body and still survive. So the second thing with exposure to air is avoiding overheating or freezing. So how do these organisms do that? Well, One thing is shell color. So researchers have found that organisms of the same species, I think that they were snails, um, that were found in areas that were more shaded tend to be lighter in color, and those that were in areas that were more exposed to sunlight tend to be darker in, wait, I have that backwards. I have it backwards. If they were exposed to the sunlight more, then they tend to be lighter in color, and if they were in the shade more, they tend to be darker in color. The reason why is that the dark coloration absorbs heat, and so if you are in an area that is colder, you would want to be able to absorb the heat better. If you are in an area that is already very hot, you would want to reflect the heat, and therefore you have lighter color shell. Sorry, that got a little mixed up there for a second. And then there are also organisms that can just withstand major temperature changes, such as the aggregate anemone. They can be in huge ranges in temperature and still be able to survive and deal with those temperature changes. Okay, and then organisms that actually dig into the sediment, which collectively we refer to as infauna, they are protected because they are surrounded by moist sediment around them, right? The sediment traps moisture, and therefore it's basically they're going to stay moist if they're dug down into the sediment, such as worms or clams. Okay. What about for adaptations to wave action? Basically, keeping yourself on the rocks when the waves come in. Well, having anchors would be a good idea, right? So kelp and algae, they have holdfasts. So you can see here this holdfast basically allows for this kelp to grab onto the rocks and be very stuck on the rocks. Even when waves come in, they don't get ripped off. Now, sometimes there's really extreme storms and then they do get ripped off. But for the most part, regular wave activity, they can stay put. Mussels have threads that are called byssal threads that are extremely strong, and they attach themselves to rocks using these byssal threads. And the byssal threads are so strong that they were actually used to research making really strong glues, like I think super glue. And then snails and chitin and other mollusks, they have what's called a muscular foot, which basically acts as a suction to latch themselves on. So here we're looking at the underside of a limpet, which is a type of mollusk, and it can suction itself to the rocks and keep itself from getting ripped off. Or if you're mobile, you can run and hide. Basically, you can seek out areas that are protected, like behind rocks or in algae mats. Basically, a big mat of algae is going to dampen the impact of the waves, so you can just hide underneath that. Okay, and then again, those that are able to dig into the sediment are protected because they're not getting hit by the waves. Instead, they're underground. Okay, what about adaptations for dealing with salinity and oxygen fluctuations? Well, one, having a shell is helpful, such as limpets or barnacles, or other snails or clams. Anything that has a shell essentially can close that shell off and trap in the water that's in their shell. And so in that case, their body is not exposed to great changes in salinity or oxygen. They're basically locking in their dissolved oxygen within their shell. There's also a shape of shell that allows for a greater amount of water to be held in that shell when it traps itself off. Having more globe-shaped shells, such as these snails right here, allows them to be able to trap more water in here, and that means that they can hold more oxygen as well. And then there are some organisms that can tolerate those changes, such as the tide pool sculpin or the mangrove rivulus. These fish can actually be out of water for a period of time and still be able to survive because essentially they can get oxygen from the air as well. Okay, now for an adaptation to a biotic factor of predation. So what kind of adaptations do you think that intertidal organisms might have for not becoming prey? One, is having a hard shell because it's hard to get to your body, for example, a mussel. Stinging cells are helpful because they make predators stay away from you so that they don't get stung, such as what an anemone has. Camouflage is also helpful because that means that the predator can't see you, such as this sea slug that's seen on this blade of grass here. It's got the same coloration. It even has little lines in it like this blade of grass does. So it would be harder for a predator to see it, to eat it. And then sometimes mussels have actually been known to use their byssal threads to essentially anchor on to predatory snails and make them have to slow down or not be able to move towards them. Another example is in production of ink. Basically, it's a distraction. So when the tide is up and the octopus or a sea hare is under the water and a predator comes by or there's a threat, they will actually expel dark ink, which makes the predator distracted and looks at the ink while the octopus can quickly swim away. And then some organisms can actually expel body parts. For example, you probably already know about sea stars, right? If something tries to bite one of its arms, it will essentially let it go, and then it can regrow that arm. With sea cucumbers, I'm going to post a video of sea cucumber, what the sea cucumber does when it's threatened. Essentially, what a sea cucumber will do is it will expel any non-essential organs and then regrow them later. For example, they will probably get rid of their gonads, in other words, their sex organs. And those inner body parts are extremely sticky, and so a predator would not like to get stuck in that. It would be really difficult for the predator to be able to swim and to be able to get it all off, and so predators stay away from the sea cucumber for that reason. And then organisms that are in fauna can just dig into the sediment and hide. For example, clams do that. Okay, and so there is a video that will be posted on Canvas under this video that will have, it will be about clams and how they dig into the sediment and one of their predators, the cow-nosed ray, and how it vacuums them up. So essentially what a clam will do is it will stick out its muscular foot into the sediment, and then it widens the bottom of it. The bottom acts as the anchor so that it can pull the rest of its body in. And then it will continue after it's been pulled down more. It'll stick its muscular foot out farther. It will expand the end of it, act as an anchor, and pull itself down farther. And then it sticks out its siphon, and this is how it gets food and gets water for breathing. And then it also avoids predators knowing it's there, but then there are also some predators that are a little too smart for them, right? Here's another biotic factor that organisms in the intertidal zone have to deal with. That's competition for space. So what kind of adaptations might they have for dealing with that? One is to attach to other organisms. For example, barnacles can be found all over other organisms. They can be found all over these mussels right here. I've found lots of crabs that have barnacles on them. Barnacles basically grow attached to anything that's hard. Or you could bulldoze the competition and make space. For example, here you have these limpets right here, and they are perfect shape to essentially move along the rocks and pry the barnacles off. Now the reason why they want to pry the barnacles off is because they like to eat algae that grows on the rocks, and if the barnacles are there, then the algae can't settle and grow there. And so they're essentially they're like gardeners. They're weeding so that their algae can grow. Or you can just grow really quickly and crush your competition, such as these mussels here. So you can see how big these mussels are. They're going to quickly outgrow other things that are trying to grow next to them, and therefore outgrow the competition. And another important one is getting to open space first. So when a space opens up, you have your offspring there to grow and to grow into the adults. So a lot of intertidal organisms, or I would almost say most of them, have a larval stage of development. So most intertidal organisms reproduce by laying eggs, and then those eggs hatch into larvae, which is a planktonic stage of development, as we talked about before, right? These would be examples of meroplankton, right? They're plankton for part of their lives. And so then the adult or the organism can then settle onto an open space on the rocks and grow into its adult form. And so here we see multiple forms of a barnacle. And something interesting about barnacles is that they actually do reproduce sexually. Barnacles actually have extremely long penises for their size. And I think I had a video here so we can see what that looks like. So you can see these barnacles are filtering the water, and this barnacle, that is this barnacle's penis that gets inserted into the other barnacle and can fertilize the eggs of the other barnacle. And then that other barnacle will release eggs, and those eggs will hatch into larvae. And this is also a good example of how they eat. So they're sticking out their appendages. Their appendages essentially act as nets, so that anything that's in the water will attach to them, and they can then bring them in and eat whatever is stuck to their appendages. Right. Now, it's these adaptations and specializations which lead to actual zones where we can find different types of organisms in the intertidal zone. So, an organism's adaptations influence where it is found. So, there are different regions in the intertidal zone that are based on how much moisture they get. So, the spray zone is basically the area of the intertidal zone that's really above the high tide line, and it's basically just wet by wave activity. And so you actually can have organisms that live all the way up in the spray zone and are not underwater very often. Then you have the high tide zone, which is usually out of water, but it's underwater when the tide is its highest. Then you have the middle tide zone. The middle tide zone, organisms here experience equal periods of emergence and submergence, meaning that they experience equal periods of the day where they are out of water versus when they are in water. And then the low tide zone is usually underwater. Now, of course, the zonation pattern that we see is going to depend on the substrate. The rocky intertidal zone is going to see more vertical zonation than soft intertidal zone is, because soft bottom communities are usually in fauna, so they grow in the sediment, and they're, as we talked about with the adaptations, they are usually not as affected by the stresses of the intertidal zone because they're in the sediment. All right. So here's examples of organisms that live in different regions. So we have the spray zone up here, the high tide zone, the middle tide zone, and then the low tide zone down here. What you should expect is that as you go from the spray zone down into the low tide zone, the diversity of organisms that can be found increases. And that's because these are aquatic organisms, and more of them can live underwater than can live out of water. Another pattern that we see is that we see organisms that are much smaller and all have shells in the spray zone. And as you go into from the high tide zone, middle tide zone, down to the low tide zone, you start to see larger organisms, and you will start to see organisms that do not have shells and instead have soft bodies all the way down in the low tide zone. Okay, for example, the spray zone, you can see limpets and barnacles and isopods and periwinkle snails. These are small snails. In the high tide zone, we get to see some larger shelled organisms. In the middle tide zone, they get even larger, and you start to see some rockweed or fucus, and also some green algae, such as ulva. And then all the way to the low tide zone, you see a greater diversity of organisms. You can see sea stars and urchins, soft-bodied organisms such as sea anemones and sea cucumbers, and much more variety of algae as well. Right, so in this image we can actually see those zones. So you can see this lighter coloration, this dark coloration, which is probably mostly fungus, and then this green coloration is all green algae. Then you see this kind of darkish brown color, that's all brown algae, and then you can see down here this is all red algae. And if we looked more closely, we could actually see the organisms that live there, the little animal organisms that live there as well. As you go down, you're going to see a greater diversity of animals. Okay, so let's look at an example of how adaptations and the stresses of the intertidal zone can affect where you can find different organisms. So I call this a tale of two barnacles. Okay, so in this intertidal zone, we have two types of barnacles. We have these little white ones that are called thamellus, and we have these brown ones that are called balanus. The balanus are larger than the thamellus are, all right? So starting at the top, let's talk about why we see what we see here, right? You do, if you're looking at this, you should be able to see that there are different zones here based on how many of these organisms there are, and based on which organisms are seen where. Like just generally looking at this, you should see mostly thamellus up here, mostly balanus down here. So let's talk about why we see that. First of all, they both reproduce eggs that turn into larvae, and so they have an equal chance of settling on the rocks in the intertidal zone. So both species could settle anywhere in the intertidal zone. But even though they can settle everywhere, the balanus cannot grow to be adults in environments that are more exposed to the air, because they can't handle exposure very well, they can't seal them off very well, they can't deal with temperature fluctuations very well. So therefore, we don't see the balanus up here because of exposure to air more. Whereas the thamellus can live up here, and therefore we do see it up there. But then, once we get down here to the middle intertidal zone, the balanus can live here because it's not as exposed to the air, and therefore now the thamellus has to compete for space with it. The balanus is much larger, it grows more quickly than the thamellus does, and therefore it outcompetes the thamellus for space. So that's why we see the brown one, or the balanus, and not really as many of the little white ones, or the thamellus. And then finally, in the lower intertidal zone, we don't really see a whole lot of either one of them, and the reason why is because predation keeps them from growing up to be adults, or if they do become adults, predation basically takes them away. And the reason why there are more predators down here is because that's underwater more of the time, and you can have a greater diversity of organisms, such as sea stars. Okay, with soft bottom intertidal zonation, we see the same pattern, but we don't see it as obvious. So as you go farther into the water, diversity also increases, but we don't see that huge difference as much in the soft bottom environment, because a lot of these organisms dig into the sediment and don't just stay on the surface. All right, let's talk a little bit about how intertidal organisms get their food. So we have different categories based on their feeding strategies. Filter feeders filter plankton from the water. So essentially they use some mechanism to get the plankton that float through the water. Clams and mussels will siphon the water for plankton. That means they are essentially sucking water into their body and filtering for the plankton, and then expelling the water back out that is free of plankton now because they've now eaten it. Barnacles, like the video showed and like this image is showing, they have appendages that act as a net, and the plankton essentially just run into that net and get stuck, and the barnacles can eat them off of their appendages. Then there are deposit feeders. Deposit feeders are those organisms that eat detritus or dead organic matter, dead material. They're essentially breaking it down and eating it. And examples of that include some crabs and also shrimp. Excuse me. Then we have the herbivores, which we call grazers. These are organisms that eat autotrophs that grow on the rocks. And so examples include urchins and limpets and periwinkle snails. Then you have the hunters, which are organisms that actually prey on live animals. And examples include sea stars, some snails. During high tide, there could be fish in the intertidal zone. And at low tide, the seabirds come in to eat. Okay. The next zone is the subtidal zone. So again, we just finished talking about the intertidal zone, which again, as you can see in this image, organisms that live here are going to be exposed to the air and underwater, and they're aquatic organisms, so they need to have adaptations to deal with being exposed to air, as we just discussed. Now, the subtidal zone is going to be the zone that is beyond the low tide line. So as you see, it's always underwater. Okay. The communities that we see in the subtidal zone depend on the depth of the water. So in the inner subtidal zone, the depth is shallower than the compensation depth for photosynthesis, which means that light can penetrate all the way to the seafloor in the inner subtidal zone. And therefore, we can find kelp forests and algae beds, coral reefs, and seagrasses in this environment. Okay, and then all the organisms that go along with those. In the outer subtidal zone, this is the area over the continental shelf that is too deep for photosynthesis at the bottom. Therefore, you can't have kelp forests and coral reefs and seagrasses because they have to grow from the bottom up. If there's no light on the bottom, then they can't grow. So instead, what we have in the outer subtidal zone, as far as the primary producers, are the phytoplankton. There are also stresses in the benthic subtidal zone that are similar to that of the intertidal zone, but probably not as extreme. So there are strong waves and current activities. The biggest effect is going to be closest to the shoreline. The least effect is going to be farther out. So the inner subtidal zone is going to see a greater effect of this. And the problem with strong waves and currents is that they can actually move the sediment. So organisms that are attached to the sediment, that sediment can get moved and they can be uprooted. Or organisms that are actually dug in can be exposed by by waves or current activity. And also, if you have a lot of the strong current, then the food is just going to move out of the area, and you're going to have a hard time finding that food. Additionally, in kind of the opposite way, is that you can also have low water movement, which would mean that there is not a lot of oxygen, there's not a lot of nutrients there, and not a lot of food. Additionally, in places that are close to rivers or just close to fine sediments being put into the water, you have a lot of turbidity, which means that it's blocking the light out, and therefore photosynthesis is going to be decreased in that area. So an example of a food web is in a subtidal zone includes a seagrass bed. So here we have seagrasses, which are the primary producers, okay? And there are lots of organisms that eat those seagrasses. So here you have a fish, here you have an urchin, here you have a sea turtle, and then you can see that there are other organisms that eat those. So other fish eat them, sharks eat them, etc. And you also will have phytoplankton. Basically, you're going to find phytoplankton everywhere, even in the intertidal zone when the tide comes up. In the outer subtidal zone, you're not going to see that that environment where the sun is penetrating to the bottom and you're seeing seagrasses and coral reefs and kelp forests. So instead, this one is going to be supported by phytoplankton instead. And so you have phytoplankton that get eaten by zooplankton, and then you have small fish that eat the zooplankton, and then you have larger fish that eat those fish, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you have questions, please post them under the weekly discussion. Thank you.